at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, as well as the Jackman Humanities Institute at the University of Toronto. So that is kind of our hosts today, our institutional hosts. I like to thank those institutions for their support in bringing myself and Julia Rose Sutherland together. I'll also just give you a brief introduction to myself in the Lenape language, which is Kuinganao Loma, ni Jishinzi Vanessa, ni ha Lenape Kutuatpe Okwao, Nunjiai Elminapawi Lakawit, Any Chic. So it's just a few words in the Lenape language. I said that I'm very glad to see you all. I'll just do a little scroll here so anyone that's on camera can give a little wave too. I'm glad to see everybody. My name is Vanessa. I'm a Lenape and Potawatomi woman. So I use she, her pronouns. And I'm from Elminapawi Lakawit, which is how you would say the Delaware Nations, also known as Moravian Town or Bucktown, or casually in the language Nahi. It's a small Lenape reserve in southwestern Ontario. And Any Chic is thank you. So that is, yeah, my introduction in the language, our institutional hosts. I would also like to acknowledge our traditional hosts of the land. I'm going to read the University of Toronto's land acknowledgement. So I and we wish to acknowledge that this land, which the University of Toronto operates for thousands of years, has been the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat, Seneca, and most recently the Mississauga of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. And it's super, I think, extra important to think about the land that we are working on, because the topic of our conversation is quill work, and quill work comes from the land, right? These porcupine quills come from these amazing little animals, sometimes not so little animals that are relatives here on our homelands. So with that, I'm going to, I guess just invite Julia Rose Sutherland to give a land acknowledgement.
Oh, thank you, Vanessa. That was beautiful. Wali Expini, good morning. Thank you for bringing me here today. I just want to do a little land acknowledgement. I'm Mi'kmaq woman, she, her pronouns, originally from I operate, work, and live on and reside on Treaty 7 territory. So I just like to do a little acknowledgement of that, of course. So I'd like to acknowledge that I live, reside, work in Treaty 7 territory, the ancestral and territorial land of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Kainai, Piikani, and Siksika, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nations, Stoney Nakoda First Nation. I acknowledge that there's been many First Nations, including Métis Region 3 and Inuits whose footsteps have marked these lands for generation. And I'm so grateful for the knowledge who without I would not be here today. I will continue to learn from in the future.
Amazing. Any Chic, thank you. So I first learned, Julie, about your work pretty recently, so a few months ago. And I think just images of your work came through the magical internet. And I was immediately really excited to see that there was, to see that you were working with porcupine quills and working with them both in using the kind of traditional embroidery techniques, as well as using them in performance as objects, performance work. So that was my first, that's my excitement and motivation to talk with you more and to learn more about your work and share it with this broader audience. So do you want to maybe start by, I guess, my first question that I am interested in is about how you learned quill work and what that was like as a young person or a young artist whenever you started to learn about quills, and what the kind of practice of quill work is like in your family or community.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So I'd been familiar with quill work for most of my life as objects, like quill boxes primarily, in and out of my life, just being displayed in the home, primarily my grandma's home, or at home in Red Bank when visiting. I've always been a very craft-minded or material-minded person. I'm totally driven by tactility. So first, by seeing them, I mean evocative objects, just something really interesting, curious as a child to what is this made of, how is this made, all these things. And so I didn't start quill working at all until I was in my undergraduate degree at the university. Well, it's used to be ACAD, Alberta College of Art and Design, but now it's the Alberta University of the Arts. And I had done an impromptu trip with my grandma back to Red Bank, New Brunswick, to visit my family on the reserve. And this whole trip was really beautiful. It was mostly just like me and my grandma hanging out with all of her sisters and family and friends, and just going to people's houses to houses, just spending a lot of time with family members and loved ones, and, recounting stories. But my great aunt, Betty Ann Haddad, is an amazing quill worker. And I remember just like being in her little kitchen, drinking red roast tea, she's smoking, we're all sitting there, and she's teaching us how to quill. It was very magical, and it's something that I look very fondly on. So that was my first introduction to quill work in the physicality of actually making things. And then it wasn't until actually, I think 2 years later, I was in my third year of my undergraduate degree when I had a class just in textile history and craft history in general. And an assignment that Dr. Jennifer Salahub assigned to us was to research a technique, an embroidery technique or any kind of craft technique. Then you will write about it, you'll research it, do a presentation, then you'll write about it as a paper, and then you will recreate the thing in any form that you want. It could be as big as you want, small as you want, but you just have to learn how to do it. It was just very like William Morrison, like take things apart and learn how to learn it. So of course, the first thing I thought of was, oh, I want to do quill work. Like this is something I actually haven't been playing around with for years. When I left Red Bank, and this would have been 2009, my aunt gave me all these materials, to continue working, which was such a beautiful gift. And so that's when I first started constructing my first quill box, which I will say now is not great, but it was beautiful for what it was. Building things in the 3D and the round like that was very interesting, and working with birch bark is not it's not as easy as it looks. But so my first box was like this little tiny pathetic thing, and I've grown from there now. And of course now I'm making 2D work on paper, but I'm also using quills in different contemporary contexts of performance and using it on the body.
So for our audience members who might not be familiar, and there's many different ways to use quills. So you're quilling with using the porcupine quills on birch bark.
Yeah.
So do you want to just like explain how that process works?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, there could be many different ways of using birch bark for this actually, but essentially I'm using a piece of birch bark, and then I'm puncturing it, and then I'm using the quills, whether they've been dyed or not, flattening them with a bone marrow tool, so they're flat, so that it becomes almost like this like plastic filament, and then I'm embroidering it into the piece itself, into the birch bark. And the idea is that you would cover the whole thing, would be completely covered, and also that you would not show any black of the quill. That's what I was taught. But I know other people have been taught other things, so we've had these discussions. But according to my great aunt and the Mi'kmaq, black should not be shown at all on the quill, which is something that I also play against too in my other parts of the work, of course. Yeah. And so the Mi'kmaq are known for boxes, so quill boxes, so containers. So you would build in the 3D essentially. So pieces that would have been sewn together. I guess you could use string now, but usually it would have been swine, but things change over time, of course.
So you're taking your piece of birch bark and flattening your quill, and then do you put the ends through the each end of the quill goes through the birch bark?
Yes.
And then if it's in a basket, you would put like a backing on that?
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways. So my aunt is interesting. She will use like a wood burning tool, and she'll actually burn the quills into the underside. And then of course, on the outside or in the inside, you'll still have all these, the little bits and remnants of your embroidery. That's also something they say about embroidery. You're only as good as the back of your embroidery. Which is something I think that is very true in terms of skill level. But then she would do another layer of birch bark, so it wouldn't be seen. So then it would be, bark, quill remnants, bark again. So it would be like a very flush, beautiful looking, mystical finishing.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that quill boxes are somewhat common in different areas. Sometimes people find them maybe in antique stores or see them in museums. And when you look inside, you see the bark. And I had similar experiences as a young person, just like wondering how that was made and like what is this kind of like trick or skill that people are using to put this work together. The other piece of your story that I think is really interesting, especially thinking about this kind of educational context through OISE that we're in, is the kind of the project where you get to choose, right? That one project in class where you have the opportunity to choose your medium or choose your focus. And I know for me as a student, going to school, like elementary school in the 90s, and then university in the mid 2000s, and high school, it was like, those were always the best projects because there was next to no Indigenous content in my schooling. And so when I got the opportunity to choose the book to read or choose something that I got to make, that was my kind of one chance to bring in my Indigenous knowledge or to find something to learn from. So for me, I think in this context, it's very resonates.
Yeah, absolutely. And I found the same thing as being like a maker or creator in an institution, or in the educational institution in particular. I always found this exact same thing. So when we're talking about like, the open project of social issues, I was instantly like, oh, I want to talk about something I actually care about or I'm interested in. And maybe not everyone is interested in that. And that's also okay. But I do think that bringing in your Indigenous perspective and that act of decolonization in the classroom is so important. And it's also so important to do it by your choice, instead of being, you need to talk about this because of your experience, because you've lived experience, but rather I want to talk about this because this is something I think that I'm passionate about. So it's good to really open that up for students in particular, and like let them, follow their own voices in a lot of ways, with some guidance and criticality and thinking, and it's good.
Yeah, and the opportunity to have some agency in your learning, right?
Yes, absolutely. Controlling. I mean, we talk a lot about how education and post-secondary education can't be decolonized in its entirety, and I think it's very true. So I think that any moment that you can kind of bring in your own perspective is an opportunity you should take hold of.
Okay, so I'd love to share some images of your work. So I'm gonna share my screen with everybody so we can take a look at pain and release. I'm gonna try and play a little bit of the video. So do you maybe just wanna do a little intro for it, and then I'll bring it up.
Yeah, absolutely. So pain and release is a multi-leveled piece now. It exists, one, as a performance, a live performance. It also exists now in the digital realm as a video piece. And then it also, in a lot of ways, exists as a physical object-based piece when I'm looking at the dress. So this piece deals directly with notions of lateral violence and alternative healing practices among Indigenous peoples of North America, Turtle Island in general. But for me, it's about pain and it's about release in terms of intergenerational trauma. And working through trauma and moments, also working through ongoing genocide of Indigenous people of Canada and Turtle Island, and across the globe too. But I'm really interested in ideas of healing, alternative healing. You know, Western healing methods are pretty limited on the scope of what you can do and what helps, or what help you can actually get. So I'm one working with thinking about actions such as the sweat lodge, you know, ceremonies, sweat lodge or the sun dance, which are all endurance-based ceremonies among the Mi'kmaq and many other Indigenous nations. But for me, it's really interesting to talk about pain or trauma or history or any of these things, and then think about what are alternative ways of dealing with that, like deep, better ways that could be more useful. Whether it's, you know, hard conversations with family, sitting in a sweat lodge, which I've done, whether, you know, it's putting yourself in a position that hurts, or, you know, like thinking about lateral violence and hurting yourself through these actions. So the work itself involves me puncturing myself with porcupine quills and mimicking and subverting the history of Mi'kmaq craft and quill work. So I puncture my skin doing the cross, you know, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, until I can't stand it anymore. As you know, a porcupine quill is barbed. So it's like a hornet or a bee's stinger, in the sense that it has small little hooks on the end of it, so it does stain your skin. So it's an amazing little thing where it will go into your body so easily but out so hard. And I think that anyone who has a dog who's experienced an encounter with a porcupine can attest to this, that it's quite a thing to get out. But what happens essentially is that when you do pull out one of these quills, it essentially grabs as much muscle and tissue around it as it possibly can. So in this piece, when I'm putting in these quills into my body and then pulling them out, it's taking from my body. So this idea of like trauma, teasing into the trauma, but also like teasing into pain and then releasing it out is something that's important to me. And then thinking about, you know, again, the sun dance in particular, which involves piercing of the skin and bleeding out, as being something relieving. Also thinking about notions of like acupuncture, maybe like teasing actual muscle tissue. What does that do to be embedded in a certain way? So these are all things I was thinking about. But essentially, once this is finished, I tease out and pull out the porcupines from both my shoulders, my chest, and my head. And I will, of course, I'll bleed out as well. And then I take the quills that we use in this process in my body, and then I embroider them onto the gown I'm wearing, which is a baptismal gown. Again, thinking about ideas of colonialism and shifts and changes of traditional practices. And then also thinking about how the Mi'kmaq in general, which were, you could say, the first impact of colonialism in the sense of they were the first to meet colonizers coming into Turtle Island from that port, and thinking about how Christianity was something that was easily adopted, and not just because it was willing, but it was because there was many practices in which you could see correlations of how it would fit, or they could understand or grasp what Christianity would be, and how it also mirrored some of the practices that were already occurring within the culture. And then I embroider that into the 8-pointed star, which is, again, you could say it kind of mimics the cross, but it also mimics ideas of giving thanks to ancestral, giving thanks to where you are now, and kind of a game plan of how to live into the world. So I think that all these things are so interesting, all these mirrors and all these facts. But for me, like embroidering this with my blood, with my flesh into this gown is that act of decolonization I'm talking about, or realization that I'm playing with. So something for me that's really interesting. And to bring back this notion of the eight-pointed star, which I think should be more well known or more talked about. So for me, that's where my interest is lying here. So the piece ends with me just walking away, feeling very relieved too, even though I've just like mutilated myself, but there's something really freeing about it.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that. I'm going to play a little bit of it. I'll play the first few minutes, and when I share work of mine that maybe involves images that can be difficult to watch, I just like to acknowledge that there's sometimes hard images. So if anybody wants to close their eyes or look away, we'll let you know when we've stopped playing it, and we appreciate your engagement at in whatever way you choose. gonna pause it there. And when you were introducing it, you were talking about the pain as being the kind of threshold of your of how many quills you decided to put in. And as I'm watching this work, I feel you're conveying so much focus and intention with placing the quills. And I was wondering what, like, were you thinking about the kinds of subjects you listed in terms of Christianity and violence and healing and colonialism? Was it that kind of big picture, or were there any kind of specific thoughts or focuses that you were relating to, especially, you know, with bringing in that physical pain on your body?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that, again, all these things come together and they converge, and they're all kind of part of it, of course. But while doing it, I'm not necessarily thinking of anything, if that makes sense. Like for me, when I'm doing this kind of performance, like I'm just so focused on what I'm doing with my hands and my body and having control in that sense. But I think it does, you know, touch back to, I think a lot about my childhood and violence within my childhood, within my community, to my community. These are kind of things that are always, I'm kind of focusing on. Thinking again about my body, I read this amazing book in my master's degree, The Body Keeps Score. And it was something that really sat with me, resonated with me in a lot of ways, thinking about how your body contains these moments or these ideas, and not only from yourself, but from your other family. You know, like I'm a pretty empathetic person. And I think that's why I make artwork in general. This is probably one of the driving forces. One, to think about things, to look at the world and to have conversations and dialogue about the world, but also to help think about other people and be a voice for other people. So this work is, you know, like, and being on, you know, Treaty 7 land too, not where I'm necessarily from, but thinking about ancestors and those who've come before me, and the deep tie and connection, about being on a certain plane or a certain land. So all these things are coming to mind for sure. But when I'm physically performing in this particular work, I think that I am just living it in my body as much as possible.
Bringing yourself to that present moment and back to your physical self.
Yes, absolutely.
Thanks so much for sharing that with us. The other work that, or concept of your work that I think this kind of conversation leads me into, right, is, you know, this work thinking about colonizing, decolonizing, how that's held in our body, released from our body. Also, for me, brings up how maybe more political statements with our artwork, right? And so sometimes I think your artwork and mine and other people's, right, we're speaking from a personal place, right? And about our own experiences, which I feel like this work, Pain and Release, really speaks to me in that connection of what is personal and what is those outside influences on an individual body and personhood. And there's, yeah, some of your work that also is speaking, I think, a little bit more politically to from the individual to the broader community. So I'm gonna...
Yeah, I'm thinking about systems too. So I think you're definitely right. Like I talk from a very individual, like my individual body perspective a lot of the time, but I also think about systems. I'm so interested in systems because I think we tend to forget in our society that, you know, I think about policies too. So that policies affect communities, which affects individuals. So it's kind of working my way back. So what if, like growing up, really thinking about what affected me. How did that affect, let's say, my mother? And then how did that affect, let's say, my grandmother? Let's say how that affected her community, as their community as a whole. How does that affect the world and society that we live in? And I think I'm thinking about that more and more as I grow up. And of course, like looking at, just thinking about policies in Canada and Turtle Island that have been written, for instance, Jason Kenney writing legislation during a pandemic that makes it illegal to protest infrastructure. And infrastructure being the pipeline, infrastructure being any sort of building, bridge, or any of these type of things. And then of course that is a systematic law put in place to oppress Indigenous people protesting, land defenders, essentially. And in two ways, it debilitates the community, because it says, one, it says, okay, so either you get arrested, you go to jail for 6 months, or you pay a fine of $250,000, which is debilitating to anyone. So, and that's a very targeted policy put into place. And this is not different than a lot of policies or legislation put into place to do that. And so I think about growing up, for instance, let's say my parents weren't married, but my parents weren't married, so that's fine. But I always wondered, like, why weren't they married? They had 3 children together, right? So it's very interesting. So I didn't understand, so my personal experience was being scrutinized, made fun of, growing up in Calgary, Alberta, the Texas of Canada, about, just family structure. And so me wondering, why aren't they married? Why wouldn't they do that? Why would they put me in this position? But then to think, okay, but why would my mom marry my father? And why is my grandmother not married to not married to my stepfather? So she was married to my biological father, who was also Mi'kmaq. Then he passed away, and then she met my step-grandfather, Jerry. And I always wondered, I'm like, why didn't they get married? And then to later learn, not until I was about 17 or 18, that if they'd gotten married, my grandma would have lost her status. Therefore, my mother would have lost her status. Therefore, me and my sisters would all lose status, which is really interesting. And then to me to think, well, what does that really matter? But it does, because it breaks down availability and, options for especially Indigenous women. So that's what I'm thinking about. So I come from a personal place, but then I go like, but what does that actually mean in terms of system? And of course, this has been changed. This particular law or policy within my Indigenous community has been changed as of about 6 years ago. So it's just interesting. So I'm thinking about all these things, and of course thinking about politics in a lot of ways and being political in nature, coming also from a personal place. Like the new body of work that I've recently created that's being shown in Toronto next week, titled Rest in Peace, Rodney Levi. My cousin Rodney Levi on June 13th, 2020 was shot twice in the chest by an RCMP officer during a wellness check. So I'm making work from a very personal place about this and thinking about things from a very personal perspective. But I'm also thinking about things as policy, as ongoing genocide, ongoing discrimination, especially among, the police force and RCMP towards Indigenous people of Turtle Island, that is continually being perpetuated. Looking at Joyce Eknyang, what happened a few weeks ago in Montreal, which is also systemic racism at its finest, happening in the healthcare system, which is not surprising to many, but also devastating and awful. So my work is definitely political, and I think it would be hard to get away from that. And of course, this work started off with I found out on a Friday night that Rodney had been shot, and there was a lot of confusion. And my sister had just arrived from Lethbridge, and the first thing I said to her when she got out of her car was, "They shot Rodney." And I remember laying in the bathroom crying, and the first thing I said was, "Fuck the police," and I meant that. And I mean, not to say all police are bad, but like, yeah, all police are bad in my mind. There's, this idea of power structure and the history of the conception of authoritative, brutal force here to protect rich and to, oppress the poor or to oppress those who need help, all these things. But of course, so this work started off, my sister came we're having a moment in time, and she's a beader. So she was like, let's bead, you know, I love beading. It'll make us feel better. We'll ground ourselves. And then we're beading. I'm not particularly good at beading. I find it's fun, but I'm not very good at it, you know? So after like the third time of trying to make something and it falling apart, I thought, you know, I'm going to do quill work because I really like quill work. And so I started the piece, Fuck the Police. Uh, and then a week later started a piece, Defund the Police. And then, you know, this is all talking about in ways that you make things and think through things. And I think when you're doing quill work, it's something that's laborious, it takes time, and it takes a lot of consideration, as well as it's also meditative in a lot of ways. So it goes from this idea of like, fuck the police, that's something that might be vulgar or antagonistic, to something about defund the police and talking about systems, to then refunding communities is the last piece that was made. You know, and I think it talks about what I'm thinking about, how I'm thinking, and where I'm coming from. So of course political, but of course deeply, deeply personal.
Thank you for sharing that story. Um, as you were talking, I think it's really important to you know, bring up that the RCMP, that police in Canada and the US were created out of very oppressive structures, right? In the US, really created to enforce and catch enslaved people that were trying to escape. You know, the RCMP in Canada is like a founding force to enforce colonization, to, you know, to also you know, force attendance at residential schools. So if we know that history, then we can start to understand that structure and how that power structure is operating. And I think that that's what, you know, when I look at this work, that's what it is kind of showing me and helping me to think about and understand. And yeah, moving very, you know, it's such a painful story that you're telling, but it moves really eloquently between, you know, your pain, your family and community's pain at the loss of your cousin, and then, you know, saying that this is an institutional structure, and helping, you know, us to, as, you know, for me as a viewer, right, helping me as a viewer to make those connections and to see those links, and to see them, you know, through the porcupine quill, right, through our you know, what is both, you know, our other animal relative, you know, what's through our cultural practice, through our material making, you know, I think when I look at it, I see that, you know, it's saying that all of those things are connected, right? It's like, this is about violence, it's about people, it's about systems, and it's about, you know, violence in the context that can't be removed from our culture and our physical bodies. And that, you know, Indigenous people are targeted for police violence, you know, because of our connection to land, because of our connection to culture, because we, right, like how much, we gotta, right, also think about how much violence police have done against Indigenous people for doing quill work, right, for practicing our culture, for, you know, a very long time in Canada and the US, a lot of our cultural practices were outlawed, right, and who enforces the law? The police. So I think this work is very powerful to bring all of those threads together.
Thank you. I think also, I'm just looking at, all eyes in the Mi'kmaq right now. Let's, talking about the fishery lobster catching dispute happening between the Acadian population and the Indigenous population in Nova Scotia, and the complicity, and also the way that the RCMP are actually upholding violence towards Indigenous people that's happening right now. So I think, in the last 4 weeks that everything has been escalating. Well, they say escalating, but it's, domestic terrorism of white fishermen attacking Indigenous fishermen. But they just call it an escalation of tension. So I'm looking at this too, and I'm going, like, how is this system, or this idea of power not being seen? And it's frustrating. So I think more and more I'm really looking at this, working and getting frustrated, but also, even yesterday or Sunday, I was at a rally happening here in Meniscus in Calgary, in solidarity with the Mi'kmaq, and treaty rights. And we did the march, and we're walking, and we arrived to City Hall, and I'm standing at the periphery because I'm trying to be conscious of being around too many people. So I'm kind of at the back end, but I'm noticing at least 8 or 9 undercover cops circling, getting names of people, watching, surveilling, like hyper surveillance. So this is also the thing, like, you could be doing something and being part of this movement and trying to show solidarity, but at the same time, you're still a target, whether you're an ally or whether you're an Indigenous person just trying to live. So I'm thinking about the RCMP a lot lately, or this idea of the police a lot, and these systems of power a lot.
Okay, I'm just going to take a minute to take a deep breath. Yeah, just any shake for this conversation, and for really for sharing all of your work with us. And we've got about 15 minutes left, so I wanted to take a little bit of time and hear from our audience with a few questions. So I can go ahead, and we've got one from Kara, who says, Julia, would you share why you chose to expose the Black part of the quills in those work?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great question because, as I mentioned before, my great aunt Betty Ann would probably slap me if I was with her about showing the Black, because it's something that you don't normally do. It's unfinished in that sense, or it's not done properly. There's some sort of etiquette that goes into quill working, according to my aunt. But I chose to use it, one, as an aesthetical reason, two, talking about this idea of Black and white and liminal space in between. So for me, it became an important thing for both those reasons. But also in these works too, like talking about defund the police, fuck the police, and refunding communities, and these kind of notions. It's also talking about corruption, or something that is horrible, something that maybe could be right, and everything else in between. So for me, it was more of an aesthetical choice, but it also works in a lot of different conceptual natures as well. Although, again, I do recognize that it's maybe not proper, but I think, like, what is proper, and, working with traditional materials too, relearning things, regaining knowledge, and exploration is really important for me as an artist. So it's something that I continue to do. And I've been using it in other works as well. Like a Hudson Bay blanket series I used the Black in all of its glory. And also, thinking about maybe a viewer coming to see that and saying, well, that is a porcupine quill. It's kind of an interesting thing.
Yeah, working with quills, it's amazing to see the different I harvested some quills this summer from a porcupine that, for whatever, I'm still pretty new to doing my my own harvesting and like to learning about the quills. But these ones have, they're very short and they have a lot of the dark black part on them.
Mm-hmm.
It's such a beautiful color, right? And to see, like, hearing you talk about the that transition, right, when you're doing these practices that just really where you really spend time with your materials, right? Even, I'm sure lots of people can relate, right? Like if you really throw yourself into you know, baking bread, right, and start to understand the different influences of those materials, right? With this one, yeah, just thinking about how like where that transition happens, right? From the kind of creamy ivory white part of the quill into this dark black, brown, sometimes it even looks like a kind of purple mauve color, is really kind of extraordinary to get to observe in the materiality of the quills.
No, absolutely. And I also think too, I know that you do a lot of natural dyeing, which I love, but you can also, I don't know if you're at this point where you can like feel the quill and you're like, this is going to take, or this won't take. There's something about like the way that its structure, and you can just feel like whether it's going to take the dye or not. It's really,
I haven't gotten there.
I'll be like, this is a dud, or not a dud, but I'm like, I can use this for something else, but in terms of getting the color or thing I want sometimes, because it happens. Or
Yeah.
the batch and you're just like, I wonder why. But I'm starting to notice that like I can feel these things, which is the same idea like talking about baking. Like you just know what a cup is, or you just know this is the perfect texture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, something I found that really influences, or one factor in the dyeing that influences them is uh, how oily it is. So porcupines have a oil that the quills, when you first pull them out, are quite oily, and that oil is kind of their own antibacterial salve. So if they poke themselves, this oil like helps themselves heal. And on the quills, it because it's oily, it'll repel the dye, so you need to wash them off. Um, and I've heard some people say that if you wash them too well, they can kind of dry out and get really brittle, and then you run into breaking them. But if you leave them really oily, then they won't accept the dye really well. And I think as I've started to work with quills, one thing you talked about was being able to like kind of exposing more of the quill and being able to maybe see that it's a quill. Is that in the broader both art world and just broader public knowledge, people don't always know so much about quill work and know what it is or how it's made. So working with, I think for myself, working with quills today, that's part of kind of what comes with the work, is needing to negotiate what people know about the practice, what people don't know, and it's a challenge and an opportunity. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Are there any other questions that anybody wants? You could pop in the chat, or if you want to voice your question, you could unmute yourself and ask it. Minute to think.
I'm actually also going to be working on well, I started the quill box with all black quills.
Wow.
See how that's received.
So you're picking out all of the ends.
Mm-hmm.
It's gonna be beautiful. We can just I'm gonna pull up another piece of your work here. If there aren't any other questions that we can talk about, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah? Okay, great. I'm pulling up Take Home. Let's share that with everyone.
Yeah, my bonnet. So this was actually made during a summer residency with the contextual group here in Calgary, Alberta. It was a thematic residency. So, we were allowed to use the facilities here at the Alberta University of the Arts, textile facility, to kind of make whatever we wanted. I'm really into felting and of course quill work. And so this thematic residency, like the end show theme was home, or to be homebound. And I thought it might be interesting to explore the traditional Mi'kmaq bonnet, and also think about the contemporary white bonnet and what does that mean in terms of thinking about supremacy. But there's such a rich history of traditional dress that is the bonnet, with my culturally with my within my heritage. And I thought it would be really interesting to make this headdress, but then to also talk about, again, notions of supremacy and taking that over or dismantling that and talking about where did these things come from. So this is kind of the work that was made in that place. Yeah, so I was making a lot of crowns too, like quill crowns. Mm-hmm. So there's something that was really nice about like having this work be full, but also be penetrative, also be dangerous in a sense, mm-hmm. And again, antagonistic, but also kind of like growing or taking over this space. Yeah.
So, yeah. And did you do the felting?
I did, yes. So while I studied at the Alberta University of the Arts, I was a textile major in craft and new media, and I love felting. So of course, felting also comes up later in other works too, where I've made felted sweat lodges and then decorated them in different kind of ways and used soundscapes. But I love felting. I think the tactility of it's so nice. But it was also like very strange, like creating this bonnet or felting this white bonnet in the studio, you know. And Bill Morton, who just retired from there, he's this amazing silk painter. He's like a kimono master. He studied and worked in Japan for 30 years. He's wonderful. And he's like the nicest, meekest little man. And he's so sweet. And he comes in and he goes, the bonnet. You know, we had to have this like really interesting conversation about what the bonnet means historically in so many different contexts and so many different cultures. But also when we look at the white bonnet now, we think of, you know, the KKK, we think of racism, we think of supremacy and all of its you know, factions. But, you know, it was nice talking to Bill about it being like, it's just so interesting because that's not the only connotation, but that's something that's taken over. But how do we take that back? And how do we talk about traditional dress or traditionality or customs and cultures that have been stripped away and taken away over time, and almost to the point where people don't know it even existed? And how do you take that back? And so what he was talking about was decolonization without saying the word decolonization. So it was really beautiful. So that's how the work came to be. Yeah. And the bonnet, I don't know, I love felting. So again, the same thing, like back to the land, like you'd mentioned at the beginning of the talk, giving, like paying homage and respect and understanding of who you are, where you are, and what land you're benefiting from. It's really beautiful. And working with quill work and porcupine quills is that same thing. It's this idea of, you know, coming back full circle to the land and to the animals and to the blessings and the gifts we're given.
Absolutely. I think that is a perfect, beautiful place to wrap up with that statement, and thinking about our home here on the land. And so Wata Ani Sheik, big thank you, Julia, for joining us. Thank you everyone who came to listen and to watch. We hope that you enjoyed this conversation. The rest of the series we've got on Wednesday. I'm going to be speaking with Jean Marshall, Wednesday, October 28th. That's going to be 4 till 5. And then on Friday, I'm going to be speaking with Danny White Hawk from 12 until 1. So that's all. We can sign off from here. And yeah, it's just been such a pleasure and really deep gratitude for everything you've shared today.
Thank you so much for inviting me on to this beautiful conversation. Thanks so much. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.